Meet Emily.
I'm Emily. What Lance didn't tell you is I'm actually here for a live demonstration of the world's best pitching mechanics. But we did this test, and I just started working with Lance last couple weeks, really, and looking at data and looking at some of the kinematics and kinetic data. And then I watched those videos of Lance teaching those drills, and have you ever learned something about someone that you didn't know before and go, Lance, why were you teaching that? So we took pictures and we did drills, like Lance said, starting with your foot internally rotated and pushing forward, and then switch them to starting with their feet square and rotating. And so you'll see two pictures of an example of the ground reaction force. This is your resultant ground reaction force, which is the vector sum of every plane of motion and how the pitcher is pushing. So overall, we saw the difference between internal versus external. We saw an 8% increase in ground reaction force. So with that back foot, when pitchers were starting with their feet square and not facing forward or internally rotated, they were actually pushing harder through the ground. But the reason they're pushing harder is almost all of that increase that we saw was through the plane of motion that would actually cause rotational direction of force. So like I said, when you look at ground reaction force, it's actually the vector sum of three different planes of force that are summed together to create a directional movement. So the only direction of force that was actually increased when we looked at square versus internally rotated was the specific direction that creates rotational force. So that tells us that when you're doing drills with an athlete, when they start with an internally rotated foot, it's almost impossible for them to push through the ground in a way that creates rotational force. The entirety of that ground reaction force that you see in that top graph was created with a to P, or inferior to superior force. What we also saw was pelvis rotational velocity increased 33%, which tells us that if you're actually creating force and if you're pushing through the ground in a way that creates rotation and doesn't create linear acceleration, your pelvis is able to actually rotate more quickly, which we all know why that's important. The last thing we saw is that the timing of the ground reaction force, if you look at that top graph, you'll see it's pointed at the point of greatest push. So he hits the ground, he starts to push through his back foot, and you'll see him peak right as his pelvis is hitting his peak rotational velocity, and then his ground reaction force drops off. Same picture, the bottom graph, you'll see he hits the plate, he begins pushing, and he accelerates his ground reaction force into pelvis velocity. So he's actually driving more force into velocity instead of having his velocity peak and plateau as he's hitting his basically max pelvis rotational velocity. So what that's telling me is that if the athlete is increasing his ground reaction force as he's rotating, that's what's actually transferring that force into the pelvis. So he's actually driving that rotation from his back leg instead of pulling with his front leg. So overall, I think what we're seeing with this just difference in internal versus an external back foot is that you're getting a more efficient energy transfer when those athletes were starting square versus starting them internally rotated. You're just losing all of the ability for that athlete to create rotational force from their back foot when you start them internally rotated.
And with the internal, let's go back one step. Like the internal is when you point your toes towards your target. External is when you point them away, just to make clarity of that.